Ladies and gentlemen and members, welcome to this evening Planning Policy and Local Plan Committee meeting. The meeting is being webcast, I believe, and will be, I think we're live, are we? Okay, before I hand over to Gary and his team, I'd just like to thank the officers for having circulated the changes that were suggested at the last meeting in February. Those have all been circulated, and if any members have got any queries on that, please indicate now, otherwise we'll take them as read. No comments on that, which is great. Lovely. Okay, so we'll go to apologies for absence and substitution. Mr. Ford.
Thank you, Chairman. I can report apologies for absence this evening from Councillors Bush, the Vice Chairman of this committee, and also from Councillor Maria Fowler. Thank you, Chairman.
Very much indeed. We now go to the minutes. Having pointed out what just did, do we take them as a true record? Thank you very much. Duly signed. Thank you. We go to agenda item 3, which is declaration of interest. Has any member got any interest to declare at this stage? Councillor Fairley.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to declare an interest, please, in item 6, in the fact that my family own and farm land at Horsley Cross, and the land's been put forward for consideration within the call for sites process, both at Horsley Cross roundabout and along the B1035 towards Horsley Cross Street. Horsley Cross is detailed within the options report. Having taken advice, I'll be leaving the room for that item. And then for item 7, I am ward councillor for Ardley and Little Bromley. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Fairley. You said declaring an interest. Just can I confirm for the record that that's a disclosable pecuniary interest? Thank you.
Councillor Andy Baker is the planning portfolio holder and also for housing. So welcome to us. Nice to see you. No doubt you'll take back members' comments. Back to your colleague. It's good. Agenda item 4 is question on notice pursuant to Council Procedure Rule 38. Mr. Ford, do we have any?
None received, Chairman.
Excellent. We go to agenda item 5, public speaking. Do we have any speakers, Mr. Ford?
None registered to speak for this meeting, Chairman.
That's excellent. We haven't upset anyone yet, so that's really good. Agenda item 6, local plan review. This is the report of the Director for Planning, Gary Guyver. This relates to the high-level spatial options for long-term housing and employment growth. Gary and his team have been working on, in earnest, to produce this very thought-provoking set of options, 6 to be precise. He will go through all of them in his presentation, and I would like to direct everyone's attention to the extremely informative appendices which have been produced by officers with maps and hubs to where development is likely to be proposed to go. There is some important data within those appendices, and that includes a comprehensive list of advantages and disadvantages for each option. Main body of the report, which between 30 and 35, talks about the development that's already been had in the district and gives a good indication and some rationale behind the options that have been put together. There's a section on employment land as well on page 38, which that's equally important, which takes into consideration what's already happening and what is likely to happen. And finally, on page 41, There is a very comprehensive list of what needs to be done and when. And I would like to really congratulate officers for having produced such comprehensive list of options in a very short amount of time. As we discussed the last meeting, time is not very much with us, and we've got to stick to a very tight time scale. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Gary. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Chairman. Good evening, councillors and members of the public that have joined us tonight, both in the gallery and online. So, here we go then. So in December of last year, this committee agreed to proceed with the review of the tendering local plan in line with a set of overarching principles. But then in February of this year, the committee considered and agreed updates to the overarching vision and objectives to include in the local plan for public consultation. And now we're looking at potential options for growth. So whilst the local plan covers a wide variety of subject areas and policies, undoubtedly it tends to be the supply and identification of land for housing and for employment that captures the imagination. Certainly attracts the greatest level of public interest when we're out on consultation, but it also attracts the greatest level of scrutiny from planning inspector when it comes to the examination of local plan. So the review of our local plan involves extending its time frame by 8 years from the current end date of 2033 to a new end date in 2041. And that's to comply with national policy requirement for a 15-year period post-adoption. And our anticipated point of adoption is 2026. So our 15 years takes us to 2041, an additional 8 years. So with an extra 8 years, the council will need to determine whether or not any extra land needs to be included in the local plan for any new homes to meet projected housing needs over that longer term period, having regard to specific requirements of government policy, and those have changed since the last time the local plan was produced. We'll also need to consider whether we need to allocate any additional land for employment use, so business and industrial development, to harness a strong and prosperous economy, particularly in light of the fact that we now have the establishment of Freeport East. There's been positive progress towards development at Bathside Bay, and tendering is recognised as an area for levelling up, which wasn't the case when we produced the last local plan. So in the report tonight, we're taking the first tentative steps, considering, one, what the need for housing and employment land might be for the period to 2041, and at a very high level, conceptual at this stage, what options might be available to the district to accommodate any increase in the new development. Bearing in mind, we've had quite a lot of development in recent years. There's a significant amount of development already proposed in our current local plan, or that's under construction or with planning permission throughout the district. But we have to consider options. That's an essential part of the plan review process. And members of this committee, and certainly some of our guests tonight, might actually recall that Section 1 of our current local plan was initially rejected by the planning inspector, Mr. Clues, because the councils had failed to consider and test a wide enough range of options through the sustainability appraisal process, and before we settled upon the preferred approach of establishing the garden community. So that had to be put right through the examination process. So to avoid making that mistake again, we recommend looking at a range of reasonable, high-level spatial options from the outset, in the full knowledge that there's some significant advantages and disadvantages of each one. And while some of the options might not be popular locally, it's important to point out we are talking about the longer term, and it's also important that reasonable alternatives are given proper consideration through the sustainability appraisal, other assessments, and through the scrutiny of the public. So when it comes to making the decision, we can, with a degree of confidence, kick out the options that don't work for tendering and settle on the preferred option that does. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about figures and housing requirements. So how many homes, how much employment land will we actually need between now and 2041? Well, we're still working on that. We haven't settled on that figure, but let's start looking at some figures now. So if you can see up on the slides there, and you've got copies of the presentation with you. So our current local plan made provision for a minimum 11,000 homes between 2013 and 2033, and that was based on an annual requirement of 550 homes a year, which is the red line in the centre. Now that's a figure that the council and its consultants really had to fight hard for, and had to justify through evidence, both through the local plan process and at numerous planning appeals. Halfway through that period now, so you see the division between the blue and the orange, and delivery against that requirement has been strong, with almost 6,000 homes already built. But do note, over the last 5 years, actual delivery has more often than not been above 700 homes a year. And actually, in the last 4 out of 5 years, that delivery has been above 770 homes a year, and the significance of that comes out a little bit later in the presentation. So with sites allocated in the current local plan and developments already under construction or with planning permission, we're already expecting another 7,000 homes to be built between now and 2033. Now, some of the proposals in the current local plan, namely the garden community and the larger developments on the edge of Clacton like Hartley Gardens and Mouse's Farm, are of a strategic scale, intended to deliver over a longer term period, and we believe that those developments could reasonably contribute a further 3,000 homes between 2033 and 2041. So if you add those together, 10,000 homes are already in the pipeline for between now and 2041, and that's without us having to make any changes to the local plan. So that's already planned, 10,000 between now and 2041. That target of 550 homes a year, which runs through the centre of the graph, was determined in line with the requirements of national planning policy published in 2012. And at that time, the government required councils to determine objectively assessed needs for market and affordable housing using evidence, which is what we did. Now, if the council could simply extend that 550 homes a year to 2041, we'd actually be in really good shape to deliver the majority, if not all of the development that's required over that period, without really having to include much more land. We might have to add in about 1,000 homes of additional flexibility, but it's a level of development that could be quite easily managed. But as I mentioned earlier, national policy has changed, and it's been updated a few times since 2012, with some significant changes in the way that councils are expected to determine future housing requirements. And the requirement for councils to determine their housing figures based solely on objective evidence has gone. It's been replaced by a standard method, which is designed to, in part, to save time and expense, but also in part to support the government objective around accelerating house building. And as it stands, if we were to apply the government's standard methodology, it would actually increase tendering's requirement for housing from 550 homes a year to 770 homes a year. And that's capped at 40% increase on our current target. And I'm happy to answer questions about that later. I won't get into the technicalities of that right here. But unless we're able to demonstrate very exceptional circumstances relating to demographic trends and market signals, we'd be expected to apply that uplift from 2026. So if that were to be the case, the gap in provision would be more in the order of 3,000 to 4,000 homes, which is, of course, for obvious reasons, is far more challenging for tendering than it would be if the target were to remain at 550. So we've got specialist consultants that are lined up to advise us on this, particularly on whether we can make a case for exceptional circumstances this time round. But we also need to be mindful that government policy does change from time to time, and it could well change again by the time we come to submitting our plan, irrespective of what happens at any forthcoming general election. But now we've got a working assumption, which we'll keep under review, that we might need to plan for somewhere between 1,000 and 4,000 additional homes on top of the 10,000 that are already in the pipeline. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about employment land now before we get into the meat of the 6 options. So the way that we go about determining how much employment land we need is quite different to the approach we take for housing. Clearly there is a link between the demand for jobs, the demand for housing, and the state of the economy. But not all jobs are in the business and industrial sectors, and not all job growth requires employment land. In our current local plan, we've got a target to deliver 12 to 20 hectares for employment land, but we actually allocate 32 hectares across different parts of the district, which in rough terms are shown on the map here. We're also looking at 25 hectares of additional employment land at the garden community. So the question is, if we're extending the time frame of the local plan to 2041, should we also be allocating more land for employment uses to meet a longer term demand? Or perhaps that isn't the right question. Perhaps the right question is, how do we maximise the opportunity for economic growth and job creation through our approach to allocating land for employment to 2041? When we were preparing our current adopted local plan, we didn't have a Freeport East designation. The developments at Bathside Bay and Horsley Cross were very uncertain at the time, and our district hadn't been identified as one of the government's priority areas for levelling up. So progress in all of those areas might suggest we ought to take a more positive approach to considering the need for employment land than was taken previously. But again, we do need to do more work on this, and we will be commissioning consultants to carry out a study that will assist the council to determine how much land might be required, of what type and of what where. So we already know that there's significant interest from businesses looking to locate in strategic areas along the 120 corridor, and that's increased greatly actually following Freeport designation. And so we will be asking our consultants to test some of those locations for their suitability for business and industrial development, having regard to projections for economic growth. So what I'm not saying tonight is that we have a specific target for employment land in mind, but we have a working assumption that it could be desirable to increase the supply of land in tendering, and that if there is to be any strategic provision, that might be best located where there is good access to the A12, A120, A133 corridors. And all of the 6 spatial options that I'm presenting tonight, we've identified in very broad terms a number of locations, one or more of which might be worthy of consideration for new business parks. And we'll be doing more work to look at that opportunity in more detail. So I'll refer you to Appendix 1 of your report, or the presentation, whichever is easiest for you. So we set out 6 high-level alternative options which hypothetically show different ways of accommodating up to 4,000 additional homes in our district, over and above the 10,000 already in the pipeline, if that's what's required, along with strategic employment land in one or more of the locations along the A12, A120 or A133 corridors. But before I run through the options, it's important to give a broad understanding of where our centres of population are in tendering, how much housing development has already taken place in our area, and where the 10,000 homes in the pipeline are expected to be built. So in our current local plan, our strategy is based on a hierarchy of settlements. And at the top of that hierarchy, we have Clacton, along with Jaywick Sands. We have Harwich, which incorporates Dovercourt, Ramsey, Parkston, and neighbouring Colchester at the top, which are the strategic urban areas and the priorities for economic growth in our local plan. and I'm happy to explain the reasons for why they're in the top tier if necessary. Then we have smaller urban settlements, which include Frinton, Walton, Kirby Cross, Manningtree, Lawford, Missley and Brightlingsea, followed then by the rural service centres, Elmstead Market, Alresford, Great Bentley, Wheeley, Thorpe le Soken, Little Clacton, St Osyth, and then most of Tendring's other villages and hamlets across the rural area are categorised as smaller rural settlements. And generally speaking, the strategy in our current local plan is that we direct most new housing development towards the strategic urban settlements, which are the ones shown in red, lesser amounts in the smaller urban settlements, lesser amounts again in the rural service centres, with limited amounts of development elsewhere across the rural areas of the district. And in very, very crude terms, rounded quite significantly, here's how many existing homes there are in those main centres of population across the district. And for the purpose of this exercise, I've deliberately kept it simple, just to demonstrate a point. So please don't shoot me if you know that Alresford has 1,112. I'm trying to keep it simple for the purpose that it's more than that, it most likely is. But I'm just trying to sort of demonstrate where our centres of population are, where the housing is. If you want a rough indication of the population, multiply any of these numbers by 2.2, and that will give you roughly how many people actually live there as well. And the thing I would point out is that we've got Clacton as our largest urban settlement, which is about half the size of Colchester, but in turn is about 3 times the size of Harwich and Frinton and Walton, which in turn are about twice the size of Manningtree, Lawford, Missley and Brightlingsea. I haven't cooked it up so it's like that. It just so happens that the figures come out like this. And then those areas, like the Manningtree area, Brightlingsea area, are about 4 times the size of each of the rural service centres. So you get a broad indication of the towns are much bigger than the rural areas, and you get an indication proportionately of where our populations in Tendring lie. What I'm going to do now is show you where the 10,000 homes already in the pipeline are expected to take place. And these are sites that are either in the local plan, or they've got planning permission, or they're already under construction. And a couple of things that I would point out in particular is look at the number of homes that are planned for the Clacton area. So 5,000 really in the pipeline broadly for that area. And also the garden community, 7,500, but they've got 2,000 in there in brackets because that 2,000 is both Tendring's share of those housing and the amount of homes that we could reasonably expect to be built between now and 2041. There will be more development after 2041 in the garden community area, but that 2,000 is how much we think could contribute towards Tendring's housing requirement in the period to 2041. Also note that Harwich area, which is an strategic urban settlement, the growth expected there is around 700 homes, but note how that compares with the growth in the pipeline for the Manningtree, Lawford and Missley area, which is higher. So, you know, there's a bit of a disparity there in terms of the strategy. There's a lot more development happening in the Manningtree area than perhaps we would have expected, and possibly you could argue a bit less development in the Harwich area, and I'm happy to explain why that might be the case later on. And then throughout some of the rural areas even, some of the villages have got significant amounts of development in the pipeline compared to their existing sizes. And this doesn't take into account the development the report tells you how much development has happened in some of those areas over the last 10 years. So Alresford, for example, although there's not a lot in the pipeline at the moment, it's seen a lot of development in recent years. So in the report, I provide a bit more information around that. So I hope that's useful context, but if we do need to find additional land to deliver possible 3,000 to 4,000 additional homes for the extended period to 2041, where do we even start? Well, I can tell you where we're perhaps not going to start. We're probably not going to be looking to add more housing development to the edge of Clacton. And we're probably not going to be looking at making the garden community any bigger than it already is in the local plan. Those areas are already identified for significant development in the current local plan, which will continue up to 2041 and beyond at any rate. And we feel that allocating more land in those areas is not necessarily going to get the houses built any quicker. We risk saturating the market and we risk delivery. And one of the guiding principles that this committee agreed back in December was that we wouldn't be looking for more housing land around Clacton and the garden community, and therefore we'll need to explore options elsewhere. So let's just make that point very clear. In looking at options for an additional 1,000 to 4,000 homes, at this point in time, we are not looking at the edge of Clacton again, and we are not looking at the garden community, because those areas are already expected to accommodate considerable development up to 2041. So now I'm going to move on to the 6 options. Remembering that no option is perfect, there are significant advantages and disadvantages to each one of these. And once we've carried out some more detailed analysis and assessment and taken on board the comments from residents, businesses and other stakeholders, it will become very clear that some of them just don't work. And the ones that might work will probably require some adaptation and refinement before any final decisions are taken about the allocation of sites. These options are high level, they're hypothetical and conceptual, but they represent a reasonable range of different approaches. And for each one, we have listed our initial observation about the pros and cons, and that's in the report. And when it comes to public consultation on these options, whilst we can't really expect members of the public to pick a favourite, because they might be biased depending on where they live, we would look to invite their comments on the advantages and disadvantages, definitely, and to tell us if we've missed anything, because that kind of feedback will help us come to decision ultimately. Okay, so here come the options then. So the first 2 options in the report follow a traditional hierarchy type of strategy, which we've discussed, with more development directed to urban areas, less development proportionately going to rural villages. And option 1 looks to direct roughly half of any additional housing development to the Harwich, Dovercourt, Ramsey Parkson area, with the other half distributed between the other urban areas of Frinton, Walton, Kirby Cross, Manningtree, Lawford, Missley and Brightlingsea, but no extra development anywhere else. So we're talking about 800 to 2,000 extra homes in the Harwich area, on top of the 700 already in the pipeline, which, given Freeport's status and its position in the settlement hierarchy alongside Clacton and Colchester, is not altogether unthinkable, but given constraints on land, could still be quite challenging. 300 to 800 homes around the Manningtree, Lawford, Missley area on top of the 800 already in the pipeline seems like a lot, and even as officers we've got some doubts over whether that's actually going to be feasible. And when it comes to looking at the detail of land availability, there's some serious questions over whether that's going to work, particularly given how much development the area has already absorbed and how much is in the pipeline already. Similar levels of development for the Frinton, Walton, Kirby Cross area, again quite challenging. And what does that mean for traffic, particularly going through Thorpe? But less development sort of between 100 and 300 for Brightlingsea, which of course itself is very constrained with one road in and one road out, but where there is actually very little development in the pipeline as it stands at the moment. So if there are any notable advantages and disadvantages of this one, I'd say notable advantages would be sustainability in terms of locating homes close to the larger settlements with the jobs, shops, schools, services and facilities, so minimising the need to travel. But in terms of disadvantages, that kind of strategy doesn't provide many opportunities for your smaller to medium-sized building companies. It potentially runs the risk of having too many eggs in too few baskets. So if something went wrong in one area, there's a potential risk to delivery. As I say, particularly if we hit problems with any of the larger developments. Don't worry, my explanations do get quicker as I go through. I'm conscious I've been talking for some time. Option 2 also follows a traditional hierarchy approach, but instead of all the additional development going on the edge of the urban areas, it would be distributed more widely across the district, with most villages also accommodating a proportion of the extra growth, albeit with a couple of notable exceptions. Elmstead Market and Ardley, for reasons that I've explained in the report, but I'm happy to answer any questions on. So up to 800 homes for Harwich under this option, and between 100 and 300 homes for the Manningtree, Frinton Walton areas, with some of the larger villages, notably those with railway stations, also accommodating an extra 100 to 300 homes. Medium-sized villages like Bradfield, Wicks or Thorrington, you're possibly looking at sort of 30 to 100 extra homes, and even some of the smaller villages like Little Bentley, Little Bromley and Tendring, possibly seeing some expansion between 1 and 30 extra homes. Those ranges are kept broad deliberately because at this point in time we've still got more detailed analysis of land availability that would need to be done. As a general concept, this kind of approach does make some sense and reflects to an extent what's happened on the ground over the last few years, but every town and village is different. They all have their own challenges, they all have their own opportunities, and some of our villages have already accommodated more growth in recent years than anyone would have perhaps envisaged going back 10 or so years. I'd highlight Great Bentley, actually, as a particular example of a village that has accommodated a lot of development. But it's not just about building houses, of course, it's about having the infrastructure, like schools, health and community provision in the right locations, and a transport network that can get people where they need to go in the most efficient way. If you were to push me on advantages and disadvantages, I'd say the advantage of this kind of approach is it perhaps maximises the chance of delivering the homes because you haven't got too many eggs in too few baskets, and it does provide multiple opportunities for work in the construction industry, including your small to medium-sized building firms in different locations. Disadvantages becomes very difficult with this kind of strategy to plan for infrastructure alongside the housing growth when you've got development sprinkled across the district like this. It's a particular issue for school provision, I would say, and transport, because you run the risk of developments being too big for the existing infrastructure to cope with, but not big enough to justify and facilitate the delivery of new infrastructure as an integral part of new development. Added to that, if you want to upset as many residents in as many parts of the district as possible, this kind of strategy just might achieve that, although it does show a fairness in approach in that all communities are contributing to the overall level of growth across the district. Option 3, Metro Plan. Now, the next few options are a bit more radical. They're much more radical, and they depart from the more traditional hierarchical approach. Now, option 3 is called Metro Plan because it attempts to squeeze as much development as possible into an 800-metre circle around each of the railway stations along the Colchester to Walton rail line. Why? To give future residents maximum opportunity to access rail services within a reasonable walking distance, and to strengthen the case for investment in those stations and those rail services. But what it does mean is between 300 and 800 additional homes being built around Alresford, Great Bentley, Wheeley, Thorpe and Kirby Cross, on top of the several hundred homes already under construction in those areas. So why is this option in here? Well, in theory, it makes some sense to focus growth around the railway stations, but on the ground, I suspect we'd all have serious concerns as to whether this is sensible and indeed feasible. And of course, we need to do more work on it. But the fact of the matter is, this option was considered at the request of our previous planning inspector for the local plan, Mr. Clues, because it was put forward by the Campaign Against Urban Sprawl in Essex, CAUSE, and supported by Wivenhoe Town Council at the time as an alternative to the tendering Colchester Borders garden community. Now, that option was rejected by this council last time in favour of having the garden community, and the inspector eventually accepted the council's conclusion. I think it's fair to say there are some considerable issues with this strategy. 5 communities would be transformed out of all recognition, and we do have some doubts about it being achievable. But for completeness, it's in there for consideration, and it might capture the imagination locally for better or for worse. However, it bears no relation to the Freeport opportunity. I would point that out as a disadvantage. And just because you put people within 800 metres of a railway station doesn't, of course, necessarily mean that they won't still use their cars to get from place to place. But it is a consideration. Option 4. So in option 4, if we accept that the Harwich area would accommodate a large share of the additional growth to reflect the Freeport opportunity, and to bring better alignment with the scales of growth already in the pipeline for Clacton and the garden community. But instead of spreading development throughout the district to deliver the remainder, this option looks to select 1 or 2 locations for the establishment of an additional new garden village, potentially delivering up to 2,000 homes between 2033 and 2041, but expanding to a bigger size in the longer term, but planned in a comprehensive manner that delivers new infrastructure and employment opportunities as an integral part of the development. Five possible locations are shown on the plan. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute we'd look at all of them in one go, but some would involve new development entirely from scratch, and others would involve the strategic expansion around existing villages. But all of these sub-options, the A, B, C, D and E, are in strategically important locations on the transport network. And the locations are A, Fox Street, where a landowner previously proposed an alternative to the garden community. Freighting and Hare Green, where again we previously had proposals for a new central garden village incorporating major employment and a multi-directional A120, A133 junction. Horsley Cross roundabout, where of course we do now have an established employment development, Centurion Park, and a location that might be able to accommodate some of the demand for housing that nearby Manningtree, Lawford and Mistley possibly can't. Wheeley, which benefits from a strategic location on the 133 with an existing railway station, with outline planning permission already in place for a primary school, but where we know there were very strong objections from the community last time such an idea was considered, and where we know we've got traffic issues, to be fair, on the 133 between Wheeley and Freighting that would need to be tackled. And then finally Thorpe Le Soken, with its station on the interchange between main line and branch line services, where the public have regularly called for the construction of a bypass, but where there are serious questions as to whether building thousands of extra houses will realistically deliver that bypass. So of the 5 options on this map, I would suggest that perhaps Fox Street and Thorpe would be the most problematic on the basis of the evidence I have at the moment, and the other 3 are not short of difficulties and challenges. But any approach involving the establishment of something of this strategic scale, as we know from our experience of planning for the new garden community, would take many years of planning and a lot of work. But sometimes taking a bold and ambitious approach has the potential for long-term strategic benefits, with a firm eye on future generations, not necessarily our own. You do also have the too many eggs in one basket conundrum, possibly with this strategy, which I alluded to earlier in relation to some of the other options. You'll be pleased to know, Chairman, I'm nearly there. Option 5 is a hybrid and that attempts to do a little bit of everything. One of my colleagues mentioned to me that this could be called the Goldilocks approach, because, you know, it tries to do a little bit of everything. It's not too hot, not too cold, somewhere in the middle, perhaps. But under this strategy, you get a fair amount of growth focused on the urban areas of Harwich, Manningtree, Frinton Walton, less so Brightlingsea. You embrace the sentiment of the Metro Plan approach by expanding further on those villages with the railway stations, but without completely transforming their character. And with an eye on the long term and the next generation, you establish a new garden village at either Freighting, Horsley Cross or Wheeley. Now, if we took this approach, there's a chance that we do perhaps embrace all the advantages of the various different options, but on the flip side, you get all the disadvantages to contend with as well. And finally, option 6. This is put forward as a variation on option 4, where again we accept Harwich and the A120 corridor as the focus for the additional growth, with the idea that it facilitates and strengthens the case for major improvements and upgrades to the A120, its junctions, and connectivity to the south. So up to 2,000 homes in the Harwich, Dovercourt, Ramsey and Parkson area, and the new garden village at Freighting and Hare Green with the multi-directional junction, enabling that stronger connection between Harwich and Clacton that you don't currently have without having to take to some of the more rural roads. But all of this would be supplemented with smaller scale development opportunities around all the other towns and villages across the district, except Elmstead and Ardley, so that we don't have all of the eggs in one basket. And we do provide some opportunities for local small to medium-sized house builders. And just to note, there is a requirement in the current National Planning Policy Framework to aim to deliver 10% of new development on smaller sites. And that's particularly with the aim of making more choice in the market and also providing those opportunities for those smaller companies. Chairman, councillors, can I please refer you to the recommendations which are on page 22 of your report and which I've sort of repeated there on the screen. But essentially the recommendation of your officers is to note the content of this report and the information within it. Consider and comment on the 6 alternative high-level options that are presented in Appendix 1, and agree that those options, with any amendments discussed and agreed by the committee, be included at the appropriate time for public consultation as part of the issues and options stage of the local plan review process, and that they are tested as necessary as part of the sustainability appraisal, which is the legal requirement, and other technical analysis. I urge members to note that any future decisions on which option or a combination of options are included in the updated local plan will be informed by the findings of the sustainability appraisal, the updates to the other technical evidence, and the feedback received through the public consultation and call for sites exercises. And under E, to note and acknowledge that the number of additional homes and the amount of additional employment land that we might need to plan for through the review of the local plan at this time are yet to be confirmed, but the options set out in this report are based on some high-level working assumptions, which I explained earlier in the presentations, that will be refined and clarified through further work carried out by specialist consultants. Thank you, Chairman. I'm more than happy to answer any questions.
Gary, thank you very much for your presentation. I'd just like to recap on one of the comments that you made at the beginning to remind members that Mr. Clues was critical of the fact that we had not considered every options that could have been considered at the time, and that this is in front of us are merely options. So it's down to us to make sure that our communities to respond to this and in a way that will shape the way forward. Okay, I've got Councillor Bray first.
Thanks, Chair. First off, brilliant report. Lots of detail in there. There's an awful lot to think about. Early on, in your report, you were talking about the overbuild, if we can call it that being the amount we've built, more than 550 to date. Firstly, can we use that in forward calculations? Because there's clearly quite a lot of overbuild there, which hopefully we can use against. And secondly, if I do all the questions, it's probably easier that way, Chair. So secondly, I was also, you mentioned we worked very hard for the 550. I remember it well. Sure, we all do. We did work very hard for that, and we're looking now at a figure of 770, which is a 40% increase. Now, whilst I appreciate the method of calculation has changed, and there's not much we can do about that, I'm not seeing any evidence that the need has changed, so it doesn't seem to be need-based anymore. Is there an opportunity to challenge that, and if so, how would we do so? Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Right, you've got two questions, Gary.
Thank you, Chairman, and no, good questions, both. The overbuilding situation, so the oversupply in previous years, can we carry that forward into the next period because we've done well in relation to the current target? If we revert to the standard method calculation, which is in the current government guidance, and this is something we've explored, you can't carry forward previous over provision into the next period of time because you re-establish the baseline at that point. And for us, that would be a re-established baseline at 2026. If it was still the old system of the objectively assessed needs, you could be more flexible. Now, that's not to say that that won't change in the future. Now, I did allude in the presentation to the fact that national policy is changing all the time, and there is quite a lot of strong lobbying from demographics experts in the field to the government to allow more flexibility around over-provision in previous years being able to be carried forward into a new period of time. So that's not to say that that won't change, but as it stands at the moment, no, if we've over-provided before, and you can't just carry that forward into the re-established period under the standard method. An excellent question, and it's one that is on the tip of the tongue of demographic experts across the country. Fighting hard for the calculation, and do we see the need and the demand for the figure to go up from 550 to something in the region of 770? And what could we do about it to challenge that? So first of all, we have appointed demographic experts, those who advised us for the previous local plan, to look very carefully at national policy, what it says, to look very carefully at demographic projections and all of the latest figures that come out from the ONS and other providers of statistics, and to also look across the country at other councils that are in a similar position to us and are approaching their local plan examinations. And the advice which we will report back to this committee in due course, we're not ready for it yet, is looking very closely at this. But the thing they have pointed out to me is that the change in national policy has raised the expectation quite considerably, and it's raised the bar for what can be considered as exceptional circumstances. So last time we were able to argue that we had this unattributable population change phenomenon within our figures, that we could demonstrate that 550 would be an appropriate figure. The change in national policy means that unless what you can demonstrate is wholly exceptional, and that's a very high bar, you are expected to comply with the government standard method for planning for housing development. But they're exploring every avenue for us. So we'll be able to provide some feedback on that in due course. It's not to say it's impossible, but it's a lot more difficult than it was last time. Where's the demand? I think the difficulty we're going to have going forward is, if you look at this graph, it's what's actually been delivered in the last 5 years. So in the last 5 years, if you looked at them cold and said the demand for housing in the district is going to be 770 homes a year, if you looked at the delivery over the last 5 years, you'd accept that because that is what has actually happened. So that evidence suggests that there isn't a demand issue that's holding back the sort of delivery of growth. We've provided a lot of land to the market through the local plan and through planning decisions, and the demand is materialising in that kind of 700 area. So I would suggest that might be the first piece of evidence you look at for, has the demand actually gone above 550 to something in the 700s?
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for that, Gary. That's really informative and quite clear. The concern, of course, is that we keep over-delivering, there seems to be no benefit to doing that, which is more than a little bit irritating, actually. So what I'm looking at, if we look at that graph as we move further on, clearly towards the end, we're dropping way below the 720. So the fact that we've achieved it in the past, that counts for nothing in later years, or how does that work? Are we working with an annual figure, or are we working with an overall figure to 2041? That's the key question, really. Thanks.
Do you want to take that?
Thank you. I mean, ultimately, we've got both. We've got an overall figure that we have to plan for through the local plan, which is based on an annual figure, which every 5 years, when you review your local plan, you've got to review again, and it could go up again. The point you've raised is an excellent one around, if you build more, does that mean your demand goes up? Yes, it does. You become a victim of your success in many ways, and we've seen this across the country. If you've had strong delivery, next time it comes to reviewing your housing housing figures, your target could go up again. And of course, when it comes, I mean, through this review of the plan, the standard methodology imposes a 40% cap on how much higher you go than your previous target. So if that stays in place, next time we review our local plan, unless government policy has changed, it's going to go up again. And so the point you've made is a good point to raise, but under current national policy, that is the formula we have to work to.
That's one of your arguments killed.
I've got others.
Councillor Scott.
Thank you, Chairman. Yes, following from Councillor Bray, yeah, it's a very good report. Really, really good, and laid out the district and highlight the growth areas of house building, particularly in my part of the world, in Alresford and Elmstead. But the questions I want to ask is of the following: station upgrades and improvements along the metro option, Alresford, Bentley, Wheeley, Thorpe, and all the way to Kirby Cross on the edge of Walton. There's been large developments now in those areas, but there's been no railway improvements. If this option was considered, what guarantee with Network Rail or Greater Anglia, or who the franchise will be by then, will bring improvements to those communities that go near a station? 100 to 300 for each community where there's a station, of an 800-metre circular radius of a station. I know Bentley's had an awful lot of development there, and I know Alresford has. I can't speak for further afield, but the areas I know of the west of the district, I can't guarantee, I can't see it, and I don't know if we guarantee through those providers of Network Railway and Great Anglia that there will be improvements, and if there will be improvements, what kind of improvements will there be along with the house, like more trains, cleaner stations, so on. So that's one thing I'd like to ask. As we know, the railway network, we have 3 major roads in our district, the A120, the A133 and the B1027. And predominantly the A133 and the A120 are predominantly well-used routes. The one I'm curious about is the A133, like you alluded to the fact from between Freighting and Wheelie. And if anyone knows that goes along that route, it's queued back early in the morning and late at night, and in the summer months it's predominantly more. And how would you alleviate that problem there? I know people who come out of Great Bentley who want to go on the A13 have to wait ages to get across there. So some highway improvements like roundabouts, traffic lights to assist going up, down, rather than left, right, going south and north of the district. And I think the A133 is a problem in that area big time. In terms of the consultation period, I asked Councillor Chapman and what could the period will be. Do you have some idea when the first wave of consultation will be? And how would you do that? Would you do exhibitions, or would it just be an online consultation? Because I like the idea that I've been pushing for years about the garden communities to have exhibitions in communities that would affect the garden communities areas like Elmstead. I know in Withenow they have community exhibitions where people turned up, saw maps, diagrams, you had officers. That worked really well. And I know at TDC we had very good officers like yourself and others that went along and interacted with residents about those areas in particular. So I like to know what kind of you've got planned for the consultation area. And as you know, in other parts of the United Kingdom, there has been large developments being built. And they've only realised they've got a water shortage problem, or they've got a sewage problem to alleviate the sewage provision and water. How are we going to accommodate? I know we have to build houses. I know we have to accommodate house building and go by the figure the government proposing. But if people are going to live there, they will all need water, and sewage will come on from that. And finally, Chairman, the thing that I get asked over the last 22 years as being district councillor here is where the dentists, what the NHS provision places and school places. I have residents that move into my area are struggling to find places for their children. In Colchester schools, our schools here, like Tendring, Manningtree, Clapton, Curran School and Brightsea. We need to have the infrastructure first, the kind of places there available first, the funding first, because if we can't accommodate that, then we've got a serious problem. Other councils like Baber District Council and Colchester City Council had their local plans coming forward. They were doing buildings and such like, and they will have problems with school places, I'm sure. So how are we going to accommodate that? I'm also finally, I'm very, very, last one, Chairman, last one, I promise. The last final one. I'm very pleased that you've got a 0 in Elmstead Market. People in Elmstead, and I'm sure Councillor Guglielmi, Chairman, knows that people ask him stuff over there in Elmstead as me and Councillor Wiggins. I'm very, very pleased you put that as a 0, but how guaranteed is that 0? Thank you.
If I just like, they're all very valid points, Gary. Some of them may be premature because I think tonight's task is to give some comments on the formats of the options as you put them. But I've made a note of all of them. I don't know if you have as well. Do you want to start addressing them?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, no, thank you, Councillor Scott. Yeah, I will address some of them. Some of them I will suggest more for discussion going forward. I do accept that. Improvements to stations. There's been a lot of development around those villages with stations with no direct improvements to stations. Some of those developments were allowed on a Peel, as we remember, and didn't all happen in locations that we planned for. Although if you're planning for it, you could have policies in your local plan that do specifically require a degree of upgrading, whether it be through financial contributions or whether it be sort of through upgrades that have to be put in place before the development can happen. And if you were going to go down the sort of metro plan line, one of the key justifications would have to be that those upgrades happen, and therefore you would have a strong policy justification for securing quite substantial financial contributions from those developments, making sure that footpaths and cycle paths lead everybody to the stations, making sure that the environment around the stations is attractive to get as many people using it as possible. In terms of the number of services, that's going to be more of a sort of commercial thing that the rail companies have to consider. Does putting 800 extra homes around those stations mean that's good, that's more customers? Yes, we can lay on more services. That comes later. That's not something that planning will directly make happen, but certainly improvements around stations, connections, footpaths. If this kind of thing were to be the strategy that we went for, that would be a strong part of the policy behind it. But as I mentioned, there are other issues, difficulties with that kind of strategy. The 133, 120 traffic issues, through the current local plan, with the large developments around Clacton already, some of the changes that have already been made to the Wheelie roundabout and the roundabout of Freighting, including the sort of direct merge lane, they came about as a direct result of that anticipated increase in demand from development around Clacton. So they're already sort of things that have been put in place off the back of what was proposed in the local plan. But if you had a strategy that put more development around Wheelie or Thorpe Le Soken or the Frinton area, which all feeds on to that 133, then through transport modelling and talking to our colleagues in the highways department at County Council, it may well be that there surely would be more improvements that would need to be made to that stretch, and safety around the junctions could likely be part of that, which could be tied in to the development. We are already talking to our transport colleagues in the County Council about these high-level options, because quite early doors they'll be able to say to us, actually that one makes sense from a transport perspective because that could facilitate certain upgrades. Other ones are more problematic. So we're building in that transport narrative into this as well. And that brings me on to schools and health. We're having the same conversations with the colleagues in the relevant departments. And actually, once we work that through, we will find that some of these options do not work. But we need to go through that process to get to that point. School provision is an interesting one because economies of scale are important for school provision. The bigger you build, the more likely you are to need a school and the more likely you are to get the school. If you sprinkle the development around, like in option 2, the risk is that none of the developments are big enough to justify a new school, but they're too big for the existing schools to cope with. So that's how we deal with that, Councillor Scott. We have those conversations with those stakeholders, and when it comes to the crunch, we will have an infrastructure delivery plan that sits alongside the strategy option that we eventually choose. And similar situation with water as well. We will have discussions with the water providers. More difficult if you've got big developments out in the rural areas than it is plugging into the networks provided around the towns. One thing I would say about the Harwich area, actually in particular, is that the sewage treatment works in the Harwich area has actually got quite a bit of capacity because it was originally designed to accommodate a development at Bathside Bay that was going to have 1,250 houses on it. So from a sewage point of view, actually a strategy that directs development to Harwich works. Might not work for other reasons, but it works for that reason. In terms of Elmstead and how firm is that zero for Elmstead, if we apply the same principle to Ardley as well, the rationale there is they have the garden community within the parishes, so they deliver in significant amount of houses already. They both have neighbourhood plans that are shortly going to come into force and are shortly going to be adopted, and therefore to put an additional allocation in there at this time doesn't seem like the right thing to do. But that doesn't mean to say that third-party landowners and developers won't argue for that when it comes to the consultation on the local plan and the examination. And although it would be our intention to defend that position, there will be people out there that will want to see the opposite happen.
NHS one, I think. You covered that with the water.
It's similar kind of conversations. The difficulty with the health conversation is it's not as straightforward to plan for as capacity and safety on roads or on number of kids that are going to be born in certain areas and how many places you need for them to go to school. The whole model of how health provision is provided is changing all the time, and you have to remember that we're talking about strategies here that are going to take us from 2033 to 2041. We're talking about next generation strategies for growth, in which time the way that health is provided could change very radically again. So it's probably the most challenging part of infrastructure planning, but we need to have the conversations with the right people, and through the infrastructure delivery plan that would sit alongside our plan, that's how we would deal with that. But we always urge members of the public to be patient around this, because if you are in the unfortunate situation where you're waiting for an appointment and you're not seeing anybody and you've been waiting for ages, it sometimes doesn't send the right message when you hear that you've got several thousand extra houses coming into the area. But it is more complicated than that. Things are changing. This is for the long-term future, and we need to bear that in mind.
Do you want to come back?
Yeah, I can say, Ms. Gover, that's a really, really good response to my several questions, and I know I'll give you two more, too many questions. But one of my questions was the consultation period, what your plans are, when that will be. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you very much for that. Councillor Cousins next, and then I've got Councillor Chapman.
I was just going to sort of question, I'd like a little bit more explanation about how we actually look at the sustainability issues. I mean, for instance, when I was looking through page 42, as you start to talk about the sustainability appraisal process, transport appears so low down the list over on page 42. And I seem to remember back 20 years ago sitting in regeneration and looking at, and I think the plans showing the urban settlements show it so well, that you sit and look at a map of tendering on the wall and you see the A120 along the top. You've got your international port going to the rest of Europe, and at the other end you've got the connection to Colchester, but also towards the M25 and the rest of Britain on the other end, and we seem to have had so little development along the 120. But I think a lot of the issues on these different sites are around transport. I mean, I think anything east of Thorpe-le-Soken is almost a no-go now, because we have, you know, Councillor Scott talked about issues further back, but I mean, you try and get through Thorpe now, if two lorries try and pass themselves, you know, everything grinds to a halt in the morning. So I think, you know, bringing things over this side get harder and harder, and I just want to know how that we actually almost promote some of the options as well as the sustainability, because reading the 6 options, I think one of the options quite clearly show a garden village at an important intersection where, and you did mention it in your report, but we don't seem to put it in with the options, is that I think one of the key advantages of, say, a garden village situated totally centrally in the Freighting Great Bromley area is that you create that ability for traffic to turn north, because I think looking in the past 20 years ago, that anybody with commercial business in Clacton sends their lorries back through the Oakleys up to get to to get to Harwich, which is bad for the Oakleys because we've got heavy vehicles, and as we encourage it, I think the heavy vehicles should be going up and then using the 120, which you could do if you go for something centrally there. But I think transport, I just wanted to know how that fitted into the sustainability and how we actually promoted the advantages when we put the options out to people. Say there is a big advantage here is that we create a north-south turning to go to the port.
To pick up.
Yes, no, thank you. Good questions. The sustainability appraisal, so that's the sort of the legal requirement for assessing the different options. It looks at a whole range of things, but it doesn't necessarily weigh up all of those different factors. Ultimately, it will give a score against, say, loss of agricultural land or landscape impact. Transport will be in there, school provision, infrastructure will be in there. And it highlights where there could be issues, and it gives you a score under the categories. There is still a requirement outside of that sustainability appraisal for the councils to exercise its judgment as to which option fits best with its vision and strategy for the future. And if that's a transport-led vision, then that's fine. You can do that. Part of the work that we will do with Essex County Council is looking at modelling of the different options. And alongside the sustainability appraisal, there's going to be a lot of emphasis on trying to establish what the transport opportunities, as well as the challenges are. And I think in some of these options, it does come through quite clear that there's a transport imperative. Perhaps it could come through a bit clearer by highlighting that a bit further up in some of the advantages and disadvantages. But option 6, for example, is very much about the A120 and using development to facilitate and bring about that change that will bring that north-south connection. And likewise, all of the options that, the Metro Plan option is about public transport. The hybrid does a little bit of both, and the options that involve establishment of new settlements. Each one of those has a little bit of commentary in there about a major transport improvement that could be achieved off the back of that. And Thorpe, the idea was, could it deliver a bypass? There are questions about that. Wheelie, you've got its strategic location with the railway station, you've got the upgrade of the 133. Likewise, Horsley Cross freighting, it's that connectivity to the 120, and perhaps less so for option A up at Fox Street, but it is on the main line, and it's difficult to build new railway stations. Our experience in Chelmsford will tell us that. But each one of those options has a strong transport narrative around it, and it may be that when we actually do go out to consultation, we emphasise that a bit more.
Well, I was going to say, I think the last comment was what I was suggesting, really, was that we emphasise some of the positives of some of the plans, because I don't think it quite comes out of the options at the moment. And, a sceptic would say, I was thinking the options were improving as I went through them, so, I don't know.
If that's okay, we'll see what the speakers are going to say, and then we'll summarise what the extra suggested. It might be that we adopt the same as we did last time, that you take them away and then you circulate and you set a wording to highlight that a bit stronger. I wanted to suggest you my own, but I'll go to Councillor.
Thank you, Chairman. Gary, excellent report, and even better, actually, you talking through it with us. I found, I understood it probably much better than reading it. A lot of my questions have been asked and you've answered, but the consultation with the public, I think it's got to be public. Exactly what Councillor Cousins said, it needs highlighting the advantages on it, but it needs to be well advertised and publicised, when it's going to be on and things like that. We've got an awful lot of people in our areas that don't use computers or don't like computers. Would rather come in, talk about it, and have some help feeding in feedback forms, which I think also works really well. But that was my main thing. You know, they picked up on the transport that I was going to ask, and but certainly publicising the highlights of our area, because every one of us councillors are going to get, we don't want it in our backyard, basically, and we've got to somehow start promoting the reasons why it could work. So, thank you.
Harry, do you want to?
Yes. Thank you, Councillor Chapman. It picks up on the point Councillor Scott raised actually about the format of consultation. It is something that we will need to consider nearer the time when we bring the report to committee, that is the issues and options document that incorporates this and the vision that we discussed last time. Yet publicising it well is important, because at this stage, this is where you want maximum input into what we think the advantages and disadvantages are. As I said before, I think people picking their favourite is not necessarily going to be as helpful to us, because, you know, I know what my favourite might be if I didn't want development in my community, and somebody else at the other end of the district will have a different favourite. But if people can engage in the pros and cons and say, oh, you haven't thought of this advantage or disadvantage, that's the valuable feedback that's going to help us at this stage. The format of it, as I've got older, I've got sort of increasingly sceptical about going out to all communities and spending long periods of time out at village halls and speaking to people. And I think more can be done online. Particularly something like this, which affects everybody. Whereas I think when we get to the preferred option stage and we begin to settle on a strategy, that's when you really want to get to that community that's going to be most affected. So that's something that officers will take away and think about. But I don't necessarily see that spending weeks travelling around the district to lots of village halls is necessarily going to be helpful. If we can do as much online as we can at this stage and then make it more localised when we've got a clearer idea of where we're going, that would be my preference. But that's perhaps for a debate when we bring forward the consultation document for consideration. And in terms of the timescales, to keep on top of this challenging timescale to get our plan into the Secretary of State by June 2025, we would potentially be looking to run this consultation around June, July of this year.
Did you, Councillor Chapman?
No, thank you.
Indeed. I've been reminded that the last cabinet meeting, a new communication strategy was indeed approved, which goes on to the really fits in what's on there, and really I think we've all got a part to play as district members to make sure that our communities do get the messages. And I think what Gary's proposing by making more use of the online communications at this stage is probably quite wise, because it's very high strategic level without any nitty-gritty yet to come. I've not got any other questions. Councillor Newton, did you have any comments to make?
Yeah, I just want to say, excellent report, Gary. It's fantastic. And I do agree it needs to go out to consultation and needs to, you know, the public needs to be made aware of what's happening. That's all.
Thank you very much indeed. Gary, my only comment I have is on the employment sites. It's got a very small section at the end of the report and I just wonder whether we should be a bit more specific of what type of employment we are looking for to stimulate some kind of feedback. I know there's been responses for the call for sites, but it would be quite good to get some more meat on the bones. what type of employment you might like to see, where you've identified the areas. There could be some regeneration sites, there could be some sites where you've already identified the A120 corridor with Horsley Cross and all the rest of it, but do we want to see what type of employment we want to create where? So maybe some consideration to that would be, I think, would be quite good. And the other comment that's come through is on the sustainability and the transport, to kind of highlight some of that. Mrs. Hastings, do you want to come in?
Gary might shoot me down in flames for suggesting this, but I was just thinking, listening to members' feedback, that the presentation that Gary Guyver's given tonight has been quite helpful with regards to understanding the various options. I wonder if when we do anything online, we do a link back to this live streaming, because then you've got more information and context regarding some of that, and Gary doesn't have to keep repeating it every time he's asked. We can say we've got it online and here it is. So that's just a suggestion.
Gary, before I come to you, I'm just going to go to Councillor Baker to get his thoughts on what's been discussed.
Thank you, Chairman. Having seen this on more than one occasion, I'd just like to congratulate the officers with a very comprehensive, well thought out, concise and easy to read report on what could be a very, very dry subject for some, although as you take reports to bed with you, maybe you did with this one, but it's a really good report. The options are there. It's for people to engage, and I'm just looking round that there's only 2 councillors in this room that don't have a parish or town council. So those of you who are lucky enough to have a parish or town council, is to get them to engage with the consultation, because you've got other ways to communicate. You may have, I don't know, local magazines or bits and pieces like that, your own Facebook page. But I think what Mrs. Hastings says is actually a good idea. Then people can listen and possibly there's more understanding of what's in there. The questions and the debate, fantastic, and I'm glad that everybody's engaged, because sometimes you sometimes listen to this and it's quite difficult to get to. It'll be interesting to see what people come back with, and the sooner it goes out, the better, because we are on an extremely tight schedule. So, yeah, thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Baker. Gary.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and I certainly take on board the point about employment, and I think that when the issues and options report comes back for the committee's consideration, it will be a bit more all-embracing than just your standard B-class employment land. It will think about employment in the wider term. So we'll certainly take that on board. And interestingly enough, Mrs. Hastings' suggestion, I did discuss with Bethany earlier on whether this meeting was being recorded, because I felt that the presentation does provide a useful talk through what is potentially quite a complicated subject. And I hope it does provide something that is a bit more consumable by the general public for the purposes of the consultation. My only wish is that I had a haircut at the weekend. I might look a bit different when I'm out amongst the public than I do on the screen right now. But that aside, I think it's an excellent idea.
I think if we're going to link it to the online consultation, it'd be very wise to send that to every single member of the council, because comment that Councillor Baker made, there's only a section of the highest populated area in Clacton that does not have parish or town councils there. So I think, and maybe at some stage, we'll have to ask Mr. Davidson to organise a members' briefing on it, giving details of what's about to happen and things. So really, we try to manage members' expectation, and that we give them every opportunity to understand what goes on. So committee happy with the recommendation and also with the suggestion of including Councillor Casson.
I was going to say, I think we're going to have some updates sent back to us as well, are we, from this meeting?
I was just about to say that we'll adopt the same principle as we did last time, that we'll have officers will circulate to the members the additional suggestion on what's come out tonight's meeting, if that's okay with you, Gary. Yeah. Okay, so members, I will not read the recommendation word for word. I don't think the recommendation needs to have anything else added on what we have decided. Could someone like to move it? Move it. And Councillor Scott seconds. That's great. All those in favour, shown. I think that's unanimous. I need to ask Mr. Ford to confirm that.
Yes.
Can go and get Mr. Councillor Fairley. Members, thank you very much indeed for your input. We now go to agenda item 7, which is the Essex Mineral Local Plan 25-2040. We'll wait until Councillor Fairley comes back. You didn't fall asleep out there, did you? Before we do, I just would like to declare that I have it on my register of interest, but I do chair the Development Regulation Committee at the county, which deals specifically 90% of work it's to do with minerals extraction, and that the fact that 9 of the 13 sites proposed in the review are within my Essex County Council division. I think it's the response from the District Council is quite succinct, and really I think Parish Council probably best placed to Parish Council affected to address that. The one thing that needs to be said, and it's been publicised on the media quite a lot, is that 3 weeks extension was given to the consultation, which now takes it to the 9th of April, and then after that there will be officers will sift through the comments that's been received. At this stage it is not known what sites will go forward because obviously comments have not been received yet. So I'll go to Councillor Fuller, Mr. Fuller, Ms. Hastings.
I was just going to say, I think it's worth recording that where you are ward councillors or county councillors, you know, you are the voice of those that have elected you to speak on their behalf for these matters. So, but where you're sitting this evening, you're acting as district councillors. So just to sort of bear that in mind, rather than, you know, so if other responses were coming in from the town or parish councils, then, you know, you'd be doing it with that hat on. But tonight you're obviously here with district councillors. I just wanted it recorded so that you've got it in the minutes that, you know, it's perfectly acceptable for you to be taking part if your area is affected.
To add to that, both Councillor Fell and I attended a public meeting at Ardley. It was a purely information meeting without any lobbying or anything being done. And Councillor Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I have also attended public meetings and Q&A in Thornton, Alresford, Great Bentley and Brightonsea. I think Councillor Chapman's the same.
Yep. I also attended the Brightonsea meeting.
Go to Mr. Fuller then, not Councillor.
Thank you, Chairman.
You'd rather be Mr. Fuller than Councillor.
I'm happy just to remain as officer. That's fine. Good evening, everyone. So this is the Essex Minerals Local Plan, and very similar to our local plan that we're preparing at district level, the Minerals Local Plan is being prepared by Essex County Council. They are at the issues and options stage, so it's a relatively early stage of plan preparation. And so they're going to have at least one more round of consultations, probably towards the end of this year or maybe even early next year. So we're still quite early on. That'll be more important later on in my presentation. Members of this committee probably won't remember, but this plan was adopted in 2014, and we actually were a statutory consultee at that stage as well. So the district council isn't a decision-making authority; we are just a consultee. So in a way, we're a bit like a parish council. So we can, I suppose, only make quite restricted comments. So you'll see what my comments are at the back of the report. And much like a local plan, there are a number of planning policies that are put in place, and they cover all manner of things from what kind of materials are being taken out of the ground to general principles of how traffic will move, to general uses of land after the mining element has sort of taken place. So I'm not going to really speak much about that, but just to say it's similar to a local plan. And I suppose similar to a local plan, they are proposing sites for minerals to be removed. There are 52 sites in total, 13 of which are in tendering. There's a map on page 61 of your report, which shows you both the sites that are there right now and they call them candidate sites, so they're not actually allocations. The candidate sites is an important phrase to remember because what county are not saying is that all these sites will go forward. Some will, some will not. So I've purposefully not given an amazing amount of detail to what we think about each individual site because we're at an early stage of their plan preparation. Our own local plan is at a very early stage as well. So I didn't really want to shoot us in the foot by saying there's a bad site here, there's a good site here, and then later on finding out that actually, as far as the local plan was concerned, we'd prefer to have better sites. So I've just kind of said there are sites, and you can see them on that plan on page 61. I think the thing I have said, which is kind of quite clear, you can see from the plan, is that there's clustering of sites to the northwest part of tendering, so that kind of Alresford, Ardley area has a number of candidate sites there, and if they were to all come forward, would that actually be the correct approach we'd want to see? So that's a point I do make later on. In regard to what our comments actually say, I start by saying where we are with the local plan and what's happening there. I then give a few technical points that I think that they could do better, especially in regard to they're calling AONBs where they're now called national landscapes, and they don't give enough detail, I think, to what's going to happen with the BNG, the biodiversity net gain. I think they should give a specific percentage uplift because that's what government requires. So surely this plan should kind of should feature that. And then the main, I suppose, beef of what I'm really saying is about the comments I've really received from councillors and from members of the public, which is about is there going to be disturbance in regard to noise, dust, odour, pollution, traffic movements, those kind of things. And so I specifically said our residents of Tendring have these particular concerns. You need to be aware of them. I think they already are aware of them. Essex County are professionals. This is kind of what they do. But I've said that as well. I've also made a little comment about I've been made aware that the consultation process for parish councils didn't run very smoothly and it wasn't very effective. And so I've kind of said that as well. One second, everybody. My recommendations for this are on page 58, and I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Well, thank you very much indeed for your presentation. And I think we need to stress the fact that unlike housing, mineral can only be extracted where it sits, in the ground it sits. Housing can be accommodated more or less everywhere, but minerals unfortunately has to be extracted in the location that it sits. Members, do we have any further comments to add to what? I'll take Councillor Scott first and then Councillor Fairley.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the report, Mr. Fuller. I know this is going to be a complex thing, and I know we're not the deciding authority, and Essex County Council are. I mean, I think we have to make it clear to Essex County Council that there are several rural routes around here where there's weight restrictions, and then there's a bridge in Alresford where there's a weight restriction. And I know it's on the back, and the parish council have mentioned it, but we have to highlight that if you're moving vehicles from one area of the district, which is then going to affect another part of the district, which will then lead on to weight restrictions on other roads. I know in the rural areas, and may overlap in Council Fairlie's area, there's there's roads that are very narrow and weight restrictions. Do they make new roads? You know, and the other thing is Sunnymead Farm, which is on the border of Elmstead and Alresford Ward, parishes I should say, that is not an active site as yet. That is classed as an extension. Sunnymead Farm has not been created. They've just recently created the entrance on the B1027, only in the last couple of weeks in the parish of Elmstead. But that area has not started yet. It says an active site, but it's still open and rural, and I think that has to be clear. There's other areas, I'm sure, that are in green that are not necessarily active. So there's active, and then all will become almost active. So some people in my part of the world were a bit astonished to have Sunnymead come up as active, which is not happening for. And the other ones, like it's 2 in Alresford, there's 3 in Freighting, 1 in Thorrington, and several in Council Fairlie's area of Ardley. I think it has to be sent back, has to be made clearer. With people will confuse that being an active site, which it isn't at the moment. Wivenhoe Quarry is. Sunnymead Farm is an extension to that. So we need to make that clear because people will be confused, especially when the entrance comes on the B1027. Further down the road, there's weight restriction bridge. There's weight restriction going the other end in towards Wivenhoe. These lorries have to go somewhere. And also the provision for processing plant. I don't know, the only processing plant I'm aware of is in my patch in Alresford, but I don't know whether there's any proposals for processing the gravel and sand. And if there isn't any processing sites on these allocated sites, then they would have to move across to process sand and gravel. I know in Ardley they have, and I know Alresford they have, maybe in Lufkin's farm area they have, but other sites I don't see or know of proposal of processing sites. And they're the kind of things I'm thinking about, and they're the things that residents are also thinking about. Thank you, Chairman.
Will, would you like to address that?
Thanks for that. Yeah, thank you, Councillor Scott. Some really good points there, actually. I do mention the bridge you spoke about, the B, whatever it is, I've forgotten now. That's actually mentioned in my comments, but I'm happy to take back any other specific roads you think are an issue. That's fine. In regard to the point about active sites, not active sites, I think that was probably a point of semantics, really. That I think what I meant was, has planning consent, is ready to go. I took that information from the old 2014 minerals plan, so I'm kind of relying on them that they're correct in their kind of labelling. What else? Was there a third point? Oh yes, the processing plants, yes. I didn't mention that, but yes, many of these sites, I think about half of the candidate sites have either a processing area within the candidate site itself, or if they're adjacent to other sites, they use the processing area in the adjacent site. So yeah, I don't think any of the sites go kind of out of district to process the materials. I think it's all done either on the site or on the adjacent site.
Chairman, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Fuller, for some really good comments there. I would appreciate if you possibly go back to Essex County Council to say, look, perhaps it needs to make it clearer that the Sunnymead Farm is between the old one and the new one and its extension, and it just might need to be made clearer, because people are going to, like, when they see that happening, people are going to, in Sunnymead Farm, especially on the B1027 leading up to Colchester between Elmstead, Alresford and Wivenhoe, people are going to say, well, the approval was not going to happen until further down the line. Why are you already digging it up now and there's an entrance there? And people may think, why has that been approved? you just need to, I think Essex County Council needs to explain clearly in the further consultation going forward that this was approved and it's an extension. I mean, there's extensions at Alsford Creek, there's one in Moverons in Brightonsea, the extensions, and I know the one in Brightonsea, I understand they're going a little bit 6 months further on, but taking more gravel out, longer than it is. So I think this kind of detail needs to be filtered through so people, because people at the moment, the community campaign groups have been set up in Elmstead, in Alsford and Thorrington and so on, they're going to see that and think, well, how's that get approved? When that happened? So I'm just saying it just needs to be explained a bit better. Thank you, Chairman.
I think it's worth saying before you come in, Will, Sunnymead is not a proposed site within this the plan review. I do chair, I don't know if I should be declaring that, the liaison committee meeting, a committee that has just been set up, which deals with residents and affected parishes on there. Is that something, but it's not part of the, it's not an allocated site. As Councillor Scott said, it was an extension that was given. Yeah. I think that the site is operated by Tarmac and they're just getting ready to start working on it, as it was a site that, it was a reserve site that came forward in 2016. So, but that's not an allocated site. And looking at the map on the first page, on page 61, it doesn't have a number on it. So it's whether that should come off completely. Sunnymead is just there for reference, I would imagine. So it's not really even included in the list of the sites that have been proposed. It hasn't got a number allocated. But if people are getting confused, then make sure you tell them that it's not, you know, it's not one of the sites.
Chairman, thank you for your comments. And yeah, I think it would be useful to, like, you've got active sites that have been there for years, like the ones in Alsford and Brightonsea and Wivenhoe. Yeah, they've been there for years. But Sunnymead Farm is an extension. And I think I think the coding or it needs to be made clearer, because people will assume that we'll travel past that and see quarry lorries coming in and out of a new entrance on the B1027. People are going to think, well, I wasn't consulted about that, even though it was in the previous plan going back 2016, like the Chairman said. I think that might need to go back and make it clearer. And thank you very much, Chairman.
And I think really the weight restriction is a very valid one, because I constantly get requests to introduce weight restrictions on roads where quarries are, and they always get turned down because they've got to get to the sites. So really that could be a very good argument to put forward, and maybe the council might like to highlight that in the list of comments on there, that any of these sites, if they go forward, they would potentially create some weight restriction transgression as it stands. So maybe something like that could be added on in the comments. Is that okay? Any other comments, Councillor Fairley?
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I'm going to try and keep it general. Obviously, yeah, I'm the ward councillor for Ardley and Little Bromley, and I agree with a lot of Councillor Scott's comments on traffic weight restrictions, etc. You talk about cumulative impact within these particular sites, but there's no mention within your response about cumulative impact when you're looking at this together with other developments that are coming forwards. Can you perhaps expand on that a little bit? Because, you know, where you have, whether it's pylon and cable lines that are possibly coming through, whether it's garden community, whether it's this, when you look at the impact of traffic, when you're putting all of that together, that cumulative impact, that's not mentioned at all. So that's one point I think is really, really important to make. The other is, you know, Tendring is a highly agricultural area. There's no mention of impact on loss of farmland or impact on food security and such like, and I just wonder whether that should be mentioned within consultation response. Thank you.
Would you like to comment?
Thank you, Councillor Fairley. Yes, some really interesting points there. With the wider cumulative impact, I think my thoughts there were that I was really trying to focus on the material, the minerals extraction themselves. I'm just thinking about how I would kind of phrase that kind of wider impact. Gary, have you got any kind of thoughts on that point?
No, thank you, Mr. Fuller. Yeah, it all comes into that discussion about that duty to cooperate between authorities, the fact that the tendering local plan is part of the statutory development plan, as will the minerals plan from Essex County Council. So it's there's a requirement for the authorities to be talking to one another so that the cumulative impact is properly considered. And I think in the opening comments within the draft response, we inform our colleagues at Essex of our timetable for progressing our local plan. And perhaps in that section, it may well be that we can just highlight the point. And as part of this, it's important to consider the potential cumulative effects, not only of various minerals development, but also other types of development as proposed and acknowledged through the emerging local plan.
Thank you, that's helpful. Yeah, just then in response to impact on farmland, please.
Item. Councillor Cousins.
I was going to say mine was really minor, but you know, I was actually thinking of the loss of farmland, and also we've been talking about employment land and how sort of 32 hectares, and we're losing loads of hectares here. But A73, it's a site of 13 hectares, but they're only taking 250,000 tonnes of sand and gravel out. And when you compare it to some of the other sites, the one just above it, which is another one at Martels, is 16.98 hectares, and they're taking 1.7 million tonnes. I just wondered how they actually went about valuing the piece of land, because it may be better as an industrial estate than it is only losing 250,000 tonnes for having used 13 hectares. I just didn't know why that was so little.
I think there's a red, amber, green scoring on the consultation document, which kind of restricts the use. But Will, do you want to?
Yeah, no, that is correct. I mean, I don't know each site in its individual detail, and yes, there are discrepancies between the actual size and what they're taking out. I can only assume that kind of there's deeper stuff and shallower stuff, and so it kind of balances out in that way, really. Yeah, what was your point about employment uses?
Well, I was going to say, I mean, that was almost, I was comparing the amount of hectares we were allocated for employment sites and the fact that so many hectares are being taken up for this, and I just didn't know whether that was considered a very good use of land to have lost that many hectares. I take on board that it's bordering a quarry, but in other places we went on a site visit where they're expanding a whole town in a disused quarry. So, you know, that I was thinking from the last issue, and it's not a major point, but I just wonder whether it's good use of land.
I think they also view quarries as, once they've taken the mineral out, they can be returned back to what they were, its previous purpose or use was before, or put a very large garden community on it, as we saw on our Ebbsfleet visits. Will, did you want to comment on that?
Just going to sort of amplify that, really, that kind of those uses that take place after the site has been sort of finished with for its minerals uses can be all kinds of things. So you know, it can be set aside for nature. They can be, I've seen them before as golf courses and you know, wildlife preserves and all kinds of stuff. But that's quite interesting in itself, because you're then talking about, well, what's going to happen to this site in 40 or 50, 40, 35 years time. So yes, it's a really good point, and something to think about.
Councillor Baker, any comments from you?
Only one, Chairman. I mean, I attended the online briefing presented to the parish councils, and I don't remember speaking to Councillor Fairley, I think the same evening, and saying it's one of the poorest presentations I have ever seen, and some of it was slightly embarrassing. I think the parish councils left more confused than when they started. And I know it's been said at the very end of the report, but I think it needs to be stressed that doesn't happen again, and it needs to be a lot better. There are a lot of parish councils online from across the county, because it wasn't just about tendering. Obviously, it was about Essex, and I think some of them sat there not understanding what the hell was going on, and I think it was a shame, because it could have been a lot better. That's just my only comments. Thank you, Chairman.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Baker. We did try to get some officers to come, but the sad reality is that there's just not got the same resources now that they had them back in 2012, 2014, when the plan was crafted in the first place. But thank you, Councillor Baker. So, did you want to summarise what we're going to include in the extra comments, Gary, or who's going to do it?
Thank you, Chairman. So there was the discussion about emphasising the point about rural routes within the district, some of which have weight restrictions, and just driving home, making sure that those points are understood. There was more clarity around what is meant by an active site, and if it's just a site that's got permission in the public eye, that doesn't necessarily make it active. It could be dormant, it just has planning permission, so that's why it's classed as active. So we could probably work some wording into it which requires more clarity around that point. There was the more clarity when sites are the extensions of existing ones rather than completely established from scratch, because I think that might alleviate some confusion within the community. I think that's a point that we can incorporate into the response. The issue around cumulative impacts, and just emphasising the need to ensure we're not just talking about cumulative impacts of multiple minerals developments. Through the duty to cooperate, there's a need for the two planning systems to work in an integrated manner, and we've got lots of development in our emerging local plan, garden community included, and it's important that the cumulative impacts of all those plans and proposals are taken into account. There was the question, perhaps more about including more clarity within documentation as to why certain sites can be used more efficiently than the others in terms of extraction. It may be something we can just put in there, just for future reference, make it clearer why is that the case. There will be an explanation for it, but it doesn't jump out of the documentation unless it's explained. Certainly the need for improvements in the presentations given as part of public consultation, parish town council consultations going forward, and the need for them to be more interactive and for people to be able to go away with the information that they need to satisfy their concerns. So those were the particular ones that I noted, which I think we can incorporate into a response that goes back. In terms of the mechanics for getting that response back, the deadline is the 9th of April, and perhaps it would be my suggestion that we seek your concurrence, Chairman, to the final version of the response that goes back, rather than the full circulation to members, given the amount of short period of time to return.
Add, Gary, is feedback once officers have gone through, some kind of way to communicate back to us the methodology that's been used to either bring sites forward or to discard them. That'll be, and I believe there's still not, there's no system set up as to what happen next. You know, that it will all very much depends on what sites people dislike the least or the most, whichever, and what the total tonnage will be, because that will guide what size will go forward, basically. So if we can include that as well, and happy to liaise with you to the final wording. Members, are we happy? Someone could like to move? Councillor Ray, Councillor Scott, second. All those in favour? Show. Unanimous again. Thank you very much. That brings us to the end of the agenda items. Apart from the date of the next meeting, I think, have the dates been circulated yet? Gary, or not?
Chairman, I think that there is a scheduled date which is set in the agenda, but we are also discussing internally whether there's a need to have a special meeting, given the speed at which we're operating and working towards the deadline. But that's something I'll perhaps pick up with you and Mr. Ford afterwards, if that's okay.
Members, if you be as flexible as you can, because you might get a date pop up in your inbox at very short notice. But again, you know, it must be stressed that we're up against a very, very tight time schedule, and this is extremely important that we get the preliminary work done, and which will guide a much better product in the end. Can I thank everyone for your participation? I wish you a very good evening, and I'll see you very, very soon. Thank you very much indeed.